was the sound earlier this week as a massive crowd assembled outside the presidential house in Honduras. They were there to show support for President Xiomara Castro and her call for the National Congress to select a new prosecutor general as prescribed under the country's constitution. Castro's demand points to deep corruption involving drug cartels and, of course, the visible hand of Washington. To discuss these developments in Honduras, we go next door to Nicaragua to get the view from there of journalists Calima Escalante and Stephen Sefton. Welcome to you both. Camilla, could you give us some background here?
Yeah, so really interesting things are taking place in Honduras. I'm not sure that a lot of people are paying attention. There was a massive march through the streets of the center of Tegucigalpa, the capital, in support of the Libre Party government of President Xiomara Castro. And she convoked the march herself. She knows that a lot of people are there supporting her. She's been in office now for just over 1.5 years. And, they've accomplished a few things, but they've, yet to reach a lot of the fundamental changes that they've wanted to run on. Essentially, this is a government that, has some sort of socialistic orientation, or so it says, or so at least some of the left wing of the support base says that, and they say that they're being hindered by the same right wing that essentially couped her husband, former President Manuel Zelaya, in 2009. So what's happened now, this march took place not only to, they said defend the democracy, she said to defend the Constitution, because she and her government are trying to see the election of a new attorney general. It's important because it was these different authorities of the state, the prosecutor and the Supreme Court justice, that actually ordered the armed forces to overthrow President Manuel Zelaya in 2009. And so last night, the opposition bloc, which is a few different right-wing parties in the National Congress, they got together to hinder the election of a new attorney general. And, they know that this position of the prosecutor is fundamental for the fight that she has declared against, the looting of resources in the country and corruption, the ransacking of the Honduran people. And so in that Congress, most of those parties represented are, of course, right-wing parties. That's 78 lawmakers represent the opposition, and only 50 of them come from the Libre Party. And so that's what this massive demonstration was about in Tegucigalpa 2 days ago. They, she said in her speech, she spoke before the rally in March, saying that the country needs to remain united, organized, and mobilized in resistance so that coups, drug dictatorships, and looting don't return to Honduras again. And she stated a list of all the different policies and things that the country is working on. Among them, even today, the foreign relations minister is once again meeting with a Chinese diplomat. I think he's accrediting the new representative of China in Honduras. And so, a lot of different things are taking place. They're trying to fundamentally change the Honduran state while she still has maximum support, still feeling a little bit fresh off of those elections, but she's being absolutely attacked by the right-wing media, that represents the elites and the oligarchs, and, those aligned with the former government of Juan Orlando.
So, if I'm not mistaken, because I know there's a conflict over it, but the National Assembly was the head of it. The president was a compromise candidate between Castro and Nasrallah. That they decided to, jointly either one, if they had won the last election, or if their parties had won the last election, they would respect the result. And two, they ended up behind Redondo. Was Redondo the president of the Assembly, or the National Congress, I guess it's called, right?
Yeah, and actually the head of the Congress, let me see what his name is. Well, he's actually been on side with, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I'm not clear, so I'll go ahead and confirm that. But Luis Redondo,
right?
He actually is seeming to be working with the government for what it's worth. So he hasn't actually turned on the project which he was selected to do, let's say. But there have been other sectors, including those led by Salvador Nasrallah, who was part of sort of the campaign to bring Xiomara Castro to power. He has been the person who is supposed to, be maybe progressive, a centrist, but who was very much in favor of bringing Xiomara and Mel Zelaya back to power. But he has actually been speaking against communism, what he calls, a socialist government, and warning people not to support this anymore. And so he's essentially the new coup leader. He was actually the one who was the presidential candidate several years ago for the Libre Party, and many people thought at that time that he represented a progressive hope for the country.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's worth observing that, never mind the ins and outs of what's going in Honduras, which is a relatively small country in terms of the continent. Of course, it's got, what's its population, about 9 million, something like that. But it's a perfect example of the way in which the local allies, the local right-wing allies of the United States, exploit the levers of power that they have at their disposal, whether that be in supposedly independent institutions, like in this case, the Attorney General's office, or the judiciary, they'll set up conflicts between legislatures and the executive and the judicial branch. We've seen this in Guatemala, we've seen it in Ecuador, we've seen it in Peru, we've also seen it in Argentina, for example. And so this is a really good example of the way in which the United States and its allies are able to stymie and block progressive moves for change, progressive movements for change, like the government of Xiomara Castro.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, how far back you want to go? Guatemala in 1950, 53, 54, whatever that was. Chile in the early 70s. I don't know. Sometimes with troops, sometimes at gunpoint.
What the irony is right now is that this left wing of the Democratic Party of the United States, these so-called progressives of the U.S. House of Representatives, are saying all this stuff about Chile and 9/11, the coup against Allende. They're saying never again, never should we have those sorts of policies towards Latin America, and we need a new face of policy towards this region that we've been so interventionist and whatever else. But they're specifically talking about the sorts of conflicts that the CIA was involved in. They're specifically talking about the invasions that took place over a series of decades, but in no way are they referring to the current and ongoing interventionist actions in Latin America, which persists and in very different ways and different forms, as Stephen says. That is what is so absurd with the AOCs and the others, Chuy Garcia in the House of Representatives, who are, clamoring about the way in which the United States supposedly used to act towards Latin America, with very little said on how it currently attacks sovereign governments. And they're doing it right now, which is trying to pass a new sanctions bill against Nicaragua. I don't see how they don't see that that's exactly the same in terms of the effects that it can have on a nation.
I mean, it's a continuation of that policy. Well, just so the world doesn't feel like they're being unjustly treated, that's the same thing that the Democrats are doing with domestic policy as well. They point to the heroes of the civil rights movement here, while mass incarceration of black people and shooting down in the streets by police continues. So I think everybody's getting the same treatment, unfortunately, which means the solution is something that's going to have to be worked out by all of us everywhere. Thanks for your time. The clock is taking charge of conditions. I appreciate both of you being with us and hope to speak with you again next week. Please keep track of this thing. We want to report further on what happens in Honduras, of course.
Thanks a million, Don.
Thanks, Don.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.